Great. Yeah,
Yes.
good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our second webinar on COVID-19 implications on international cooperation and especially development cooperation. My name is Stefan Klingebiel. I'm heading the UNDP Seoul Policy Center. Last week we had already a very inspiring discussion on Thursday on our topic with 4 great scholars and think tank representatives. There was no clear joint outcome or consensus based on the discussion. However, against the background of the first webinar, I wish to spell out one maybe additional question or one thought. I think one implicit aspect we were discussing was, are we going to see a real change of the system, how international cooperation and development cooperation is organized, or is what we are expecting from this kind of crisis rather that those trends which we were observing already for the last couple of years, that those trends will be just accelerated? Yeah, I think this is a quite interesting aspect. And last time I think we were mainly discussing those aspects where we see this kind of higher speed of changes. For today, we have even 5 great panelists, and I will introduce one by one in a minute. Before I do that, let me just mention a few housekeeping things. The first one is this webinar is recorded, and people can watch this video clip later on. I'm in a need to be very strict about our time frame. So after 8 minutes, Yasmin is going to remind our panelists that only 2 minutes are left. And once those 10 minutes in total are over, I will really need to stop, unfortunately, our panelists. Tonight, the chat function will be enabled for all panelists and for all webinar participants. So you can comment all the time, you can raise questions, you can also give feedback about this webinar format and our webinar today. We will hopefully have few minutes after our 5 inputs from our panelists at the end to listen to few real questions from you. So if you have an interest to raise a question, please raise your hand. There's this raise your hand function, and then we will pick up a few of them, and maybe we are also reading out few questions you are raising via the chat function. At the end, hopefully we have a bit of time that our 5 panelists can respond very briefly, maybe to 1 or 2 aspects. So I would like to give the floor at the beginning to Andrea Ordonez from Southern Voice. She's based in Quito, Ecuador. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan, and well, good morning from this side of the world. It's a pleasure to join the panelists and all the participants today. Well, I think that following up the discussion of the previous webinar and some of the guiding questions that we received, I've been thinking about this question of the scenarios of what's going to happen with development cooperation, and I think that one important aspect is that at the end, what we will see in the longer term with development cooperation, I think will be highly dependent on how the international community is able to respond to the crisis. So we need to really think not of COVID-19 only as an external factor affecting international cooperation, but as a task for international cooperation in the immediate term, of course, but also in the medium term. So that's how I've been framing it, because it's difficult to see it separate as something totally external to development cooperation. I think that in the immediate term, we've seen a lack of leadership, gaps in how to approach it, but we have the middle term still to have a more coherent and cohesive response. And I think that if in that medium term of response, the international community can show a more proactive take on this crisis, that would have positive implications in the longer term for what we can see in international cooperation. So a few ideas on the changes that we might see. I think that one aspect that was already also brought up a bit in the previous webinar was this discussion of whether the rationale and the purpose of international cooperation should move more heavily towards global public goods, or if it should stay at these direct support for countries, developing countries and poorer countries. And I think that what we're seeing from these initial weeks of response to the crisis is that these two levels of support are very intertwined. That while I think many feel the gaps of not having a lot of public goods that we would want to confront the crisis, we also see that it's not enough to have those high-level global public goods, but to have the systems in place at the national level, at the local level, to make use to take advantage of these goods, of these global knowledge, of global technology, and so on. So I think that would be my first point in relation to, in terms of the rationale and the purpose of development cooperation. We should aim for a combination of both of these, that we cannot think of them in a way that it's one instead of the other one. And I think that's something that the crisis has been showing us so far. Then I think that the third, my third comment will be around the process, or how the international community is responding to the crisis. It seems to me that what we're seeing is that the current global platforms have not been fit for action. Like we've created global platforms more in line with monitoring, more in line with learning, but not so much with a framework of action and of response. So I think that's a gap that we will have to, see how to work out in these next months to improve the response of these global platforms, not only in the concrete aspects of monitoring what's being done, but really enabling cooperation to respond more cohesively. No? So, where are development partners finding information about what is needed, how much, where, and really for that to enable them to take action. That's something that we see missing. And in some of the developing countries, we do have national platforms of coordination and cooperation. And I think this will be a moment for these national level platforms to be tested, to see if countries that have been able to create, working groups, there are different modalities that exist, but working groups and so on between development partners, if those can be really the spaces to coordinate, cooperate, and make sure that the responses are not just small actions by different donors, but how can they be more cohesive in a moment where a more integral response will be needed in many of the places. And for the countries where these platforms do not exist or they're not in place, I think we'll have to see if the reforms around the UN system, the resident coordinator system, will enable the UN system in the country level to take some of these roles of coordination and bringing development partners together. And I think my final point would be that in terms of what we need to see, what type of support we need, I think here it's clear that we should stop the discussion of whether what we need is more financial resources or development of capacities that we've been seeing a lot in the last few discussions around development cooperation. And it has become clear that without the capabilities and the capacities, there are no funds that are enough. And I think we've seen that not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries, that there's a limit to where financial resources can take us.
We are at 8 minutes.
And then we'll need other we need those capabilities, knowledge, information, and so on. So yeah, that was my last point. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I think that was a great start with many good points. I mean, just to highlight two, the national platforms that they are tested now, I think that would be really worth to go more to the details when it comes to those mechanisms. Do they play another role? And also the resident coordinator system for the United Nations. I think since we are experiencing this reform process for the last couple of months, 1 or 2 years, would be also interesting to see what are first experiences in this regard. Great, thank you so much. Let's turn to Iain Mitchell. He's working at the Centre for Global Development in London, UK. Iain, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Stefan, and interesting to hear Andrea's comments. And I think I agree with her that what the implications are of this crisis depend on how we handle it. And in fact, when I was preparing for this session, I wanted to challenge myself and think, what is actually different now that we have COVID, rather than you see a lot of people just using COVID as an excuse to dust off the previous things that they've argued for and argue for them afresh. So I've got 3 things that I want to highlight, and I think there's some learning for us in. So first and most obviously, we've got a new disease with high spread and high health impacts that we didn't have before, and you can see every country in the world struggling with balancing the costs of activity with the transmission risk, trying to find the right balance between those, and using the use of different technologies to do that. And maybe if there's time, Stefan, you can repeat what you said about the daily regime in South Korea, which I think is very interesting. I mean, I think there's a few points to draw out of this for us on development. I mean, one is that when we had Spanish flu at the start of the last centuries, we didn't have the possibility to control that disease. We didn't have the technology, the information sharing. Effectively, it was just allowed to go, and we're in a stronger position now. So we've got there's a new opportunity to control this disease that didn't exist previously. But it's also, as Andrea says, it's not a done deal at all. I mean, many countries, especially in the south, are only just experiencing the disease. Getting that balance right is extremely difficult for everybody. The trade-offs are different for every country in every circumstance. And there are big risks that we all need to be switched on to as policy advisors and makers. I mean, trade openness is clearly one. Intellectual property rights is another. And the other thing that I worked on horizon scanning in UK government was the secondary risk, or having a primary risk materialise and then having a secondary risk. So in 2008, in the food price spike, most of the food price spike was caused by the policy response, not by the production shortages. And so that risk definitely exists here, and we don't quite know how that will manifest itself. So I think we all need to be focused on the optimum response and making sure that the policies we need on trade and IPR are as we hope them to be. So the second big thing, I suppose, is this, the willingness to impose controls and economic costs to improve public health. So we've never seen that before, and one of the consequences, of course, is that we've surely triggered the largest recession ever seen. I mean, I think estimates are going up all the time, but I think it's plausible that at least the G7 could lose 20% of GDP. It's also synchronized in a way that certainly the last financial crisis wasn't. The global south effectively grew all the way through the last financial crisis, but it seems unlikely that's going to be the case this time. It's accompanied by a commodity collapse that again wasn't present in the last crisis. So there is a major economic event here that I don't think we're prepared for, and I think we're still underestimating. It's going to last for a long time. On the positive side, it's not born of any kind of fundamental economic correction. It's you could question for the audience, could we call this the 2021 economic pause? We aren't actually destroying any of the value, but you need a strong fiscal response. You need to look out for inflation and the social support, making sure that the economic output that is produced is distributed among the population that need it. And I think that's a major challenge. So the third point, I think, is interesting. So I've seen people argue that this is about global cooperation. Global cooperation is different now because the value of it has changed. That is, I think, the third big change for me. I am interested that people, especially in the aid sector and the international development sector, immediately say, oh, does this mean that aid will be diverted from those that need it most into global public goods? Why on earth should it? What we've just discovered is that there are these major returns to global cooperation and major exposure of risk in global economic trade. Why on earth would the first port of call for dealing with that challenge and opportunity be the very tiny amount of money we give to the poorest parts of the world? I think we're being narrow-minded in thinking like that. What we've seen is, for every economy and government, that there's a larger return to cooperating globally. And I think we take a lot of it for granted. So you can clearly criticize the way that the disease was immediately communicated, but it was communicated globally and quickly understood in a matter of weeks, thanks to the World Health Organization, the knowledge networks that have been established, and global multilateralism. And I think in the development community, we've glibly skipped over that and taking it all for granted. I think we need to be advertising that. You can see, we will now be able to see that there's a let's say a 1 in 10 year risk of losing 10% of the global economy that could be managed with probably a very small amount of money, and that business case will soon be extremely strong. That said, again, we're not through it yet. There are other global public good issues that are going to arise during this. The technology around testing, the sharing of knowledge around control policies, not to mention, obviously, the development and distribution of vaccines. But again, that's a great example where hopefully a vaccine developed in one part of the world will quickly be shared globally. And that is a triumph for global cooperation, and we need to absolutely advertise that. So just a couple of final points. I think on the question of sort of stepping up in global leadership, I do think it's interesting that you're seeing a change in global roles now and global leaders, with the US not obviously taking on that role in the way it has in the past, and that is leaving the door open for others, and the demonstration that there isn't always a north to south flow of cooperation. So these paradigms are changing. We've done some work on finance for international development, just that narrow part of what countries do for each other financially. And there's a new blog out and a new measure out that we've published this week, where I'll share the link with people. And it's, the story that tells, I think, though, is that there are quite a number of countries who are not contributing as much as you might expect for their level of development. And interestingly, China is one of them. So as valuable as it is for China to be sharing some of its, some ventilators, some tests with other countries, or on that base, on a cooperative basis, actually that's relatively small compared to what you might expect from a country the size and development level of China in terms of its financial development. The US is the other major performer there. I mean, it's incredible how little the US provides relative to the size of its economy. So we're not picking on China, but there are a number of countries that we think can step up their inputs to the system. I've seen a couple of questions on the thread asking about the resources that go to development in the light of shrinking GDP. The last global financial crisis didn't really see a drop in overseas development assistance as measured by the OECD. And again, I think if you go back to the returns, then the needs are greater in the poorest countries, and this crisis means that that's even greater, and the returns to global cooperation have just increased. So I think the GDP is shrinking, but public effort is not. So I think that's pretty much it from me. So I think highlighting the global cooperation, being ready for the degree of economic slowdown and the length of it, the importance of multilateralism. I haven't talked much about sort of unconventional radical policy responses, which Jonathan Glennie raised. But I think there's something in that, and the role of social insurance. And I think, yes, this is a time for new and renewed global leadership from the G20 in particular. And there's a number of ways that can be taken forward. But let's not be distracted by small political acts. Let's ask for the big financial and other policy commitments.
Great. Thank you so much, Iain. That was extremely inspiring as well. I mean, all these aspects you were covering, I mean, quality of cooperation and leadership, I think those are really very crucial aspects. And I mean, one follow-up question could be, what kind of institutional setting, global institutions regime are we going to expect for the future? Is there any kind of change or not based on this? Just one hint, have also a look at our chat function. We really have a number of great comments and questions. So of course our presenters are great, and at the same time we receive those great comments from our audience from all over the world. So let me hand over to Goku. Goku is professor at China Agricultural University in Beijing. And we are really glad to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Yes, I'm sorry for my net. Is that clear for you?
It's working.
It's working. Okay, I will try to speak loud. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, colleagues. So I will just express the 3 points here. The first one is that from this crisis, and also some measures taken, including those containment, and also some measures for coping with the reverse impacts. And then we have to reflect on the development goals. This is also very important for the further international development cooperation. So far, we have this sustainable development goals, and we are trying very hard. And the whole international community is also trying very hard on this. But at the same time, actually, we all have some very basic thinking that we usually have some entry point for like some economic standard improving, those poverty elevation, and also this zero hunger, all those things. But at the same time, all those environmental issues, public health, actually are just in paralleling with those very basic needs. And for a very long time, in the last several decades, actually we are just trying our best to focus more on those very quite relevant and with very long-term effects areas. But because of some we can see some immediately benefits attraction. So it's still very difficult just to move ahead, and there were already very discussion. And at those moments, I think we can take this opportunity actually to just review what we have done, and what still the deficiency is still there, and we have to just decentralization and also the economic centered ideals. And this is the first one. It's just a good opportunity. And the second one to point is that actually from these measures taken by different countries and different organizations, we can tell that there is not a perfect system or mechanism for dealing with those emerging crises. And at the same time, we have to reflect also on if we really have a very perfect mechanism for this international collaboration. Though there were already many collaboration among the states, among the different organizations, and also international organizations, regional organizations, and all those states and enterprises, social organizations already actually tried in their way to just provide support for overcoming this crisis. But at the same time, it seems it's really very difficult to tell if we still need a kind of a concentrated collaboration system for guiding and for overcoming the possible very adverse impacts in future. It's really very difficult to tell. So we have to accept the facts that in the reality, there is not a perfect this mechanism for coping with the crisis or emerging crisis. Either it has not a perfect mechanism for this collaboration. So in this aspect, actually I want to mention that so far, though there are many actually deglobalization actions already appeared for corresponding to this crisis, it still has many very strong support actually for overcoming this situation and also for sustained stability of the economy. For example, as the colleagues already mentioned, the WHO already did a lot for not only for the call for the collaboration, but also for this information sharing. And we can see also the already this capacity building platform built up in internet, and also the UN system, different organizations also try its best from its expertise to respond and to recover, to support for the recovery from this pandemic, and focusing particularly on the most vulnerable. And for the regional organizations, actually we can see also some positive reactions. For example, even those new or emerging organization, for example, AIIB is proposing this new crisis recovery fertility. Maybe we can think maybe it's just for the moment. We cannot just see the very long term, but at least from this moment, we can already see that the existing or the traditional, we can see the traditional international organizations played a very important role. At the same time, those new organizations also could play some roles in this process and also for future collaboration. And so from this part, actually, I want to re-emphasize, actually, this is not a perfect a mechanism, but still there are different, nowadays we can see alternatives for this international community actually to adapt and also to put into use. And the third point I want to mention is that the participation of the various stakeholders nowadays is very important. From this process, we can see many changes in this primary collaboration. For example, nowadays many enterprises and also social organizations already played a very important role. I just want to give the example from China. In China, in the past time, it cannot imagine that the social organizations can do all those supportive action automatically. I mean, in this emerging crisis, normally the government led the way, but in this time, actually, we can see many announcements from the government and also its own like containment and also the support for the for people and other things. But at the same time, it's really very surprise that
8 minutes are almost over.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I just wrap up. And so from this moment, I do think it's also a way, an opportunity for we think about that involving different stakeholders, and also for this one, I think it can also contribute more than what we can expect, and also at the same time. For the international development cooperation, it cannot be just within the development cooperation only. We already talked about this for many times, but this time we just saw it just in very real situation. The entire chain, and including the investment, trading, development cooperation, all those things must work as an ecosystem to survive intact. And then the way of sharing will be more diversified, and also the participated stakeholders will be also more diversified. So collaboration on not only those physical issues, but also the discussion on the development and the capacity building, and also the learning process and the dynamic of this mechanism change also will be like I do think in the future international development cooperation mechanism. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kigobo. That was really very helpful. This kind of view about the Chinese approach, but also your emphasis on the institutional setting, and I think this is really something what we need to follow up. What kind of institutional needs in terms of international organizations do we see? What kind of response do we expect? So to have this kind of focus on those questions is really something what is highly critical. Let me just turn to our next panelist. We have Paulo Esteves. Paulo is director of the BRICS Policy Center in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Paulo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan. Thanks for having me. I need somebody to allow me to share my screen, please.
Yeah, Yasmin will do this.
It should be allowed right now.
Now, yeah. Perfect.
Sorry.
No problem. Thank you. So, are you guys seeing this?
Yes.
Is it working? Okay. So, I follow strictly the 3 questions that Stefan suggested to us. So, first, in terms of scenarios, everybody knows these 2 scenarios that were built either by the OECD or the McKinsey. And everybody knows that we are closer and closer to the second scenario, the domino effect, which will mean that the economy will recover, the world economy will recover by 2022. The Eurozone will recover by 2023, and God knows when the developing world will recover. So we are closer to the second scenario. In terms of the response, but in any case, what we know already is that the COVID exposes and deepens existing inequalities, both within countries and among countries, and it exposed particularly vulnerable people. Vulnerable people are dying in the US. Vulnerable people are dying in Ecuador and will die in large numbers in Brazil. COVID-19 is a coupled crisis. First of all, is a humanitarian crisis, and we should look at it from a humanitarian lenses as well, which is followed by an economic crisis.
Paulo, could you maybe enable your full screen mode? The participants were asking.
Okay, just a sec. Let me try one thing here. Sorry about that. Let's see if this will work. Is it working now?
That's bigger. Thank you. Yes, perfect.
It's better now? Okay. In terms of responses, I draw three scenarios. The new normal, which is basically what we have now, which is basically international competition, when we are seeing now a fierce competition around testing devices and respirators, for instance, but followed by something that we never expected, which is national competition, which is happening in the US, where the federal government is actually fighting the governors, and it's happening also in Brazil, where the federal government is actually jeopardizing the initiatives from the states. Multilateral and club paralysis, the response of the G20 was non-existent. Regional failure, the European Union did not respond at all as a union to this crisis. There is no answer, there is no response in the Americas, and there is no response in Latin America or South America. Probably we don't have this data yet. Probably we're going to see the decrease or the shift from ODA flows, and the crisis will fuel the US and China rivalry. The second scenario is about the old normal, which is basically what apparently the government of South Korea is asking for. There is a paper published today in the Project Syndicate, written by the Minister of Economics and Finance from South Korea, in which he pledges for a G20 action plan, which would include stimulus packages, quarantine coordination, and a clear exit strategy. And some kind of multilateral reform for strengthening global health security regime. It's not about strengthening global health, but it is about strengthening the security regime within the global health agenda. It's basically pandemic control, which is something that President Obama already tried before. We could see the stability of in ODA and other concessional flows, and the crisis will trigger the coordination about developed countries, but only in terms of coordination, loose coordination to tackle the crisis. The third scenario, and I'm sorry, this is something that I think we have to insist, is look again to the global public goods agenda. In that case, and this is particularly what I think we need now. We need mitigation strategies in developing countries urgently, and we need recovering packages. We need a multilateral reform, which is not led by the international financial institutions, but it is led by the UN development system. The increasing in ODA and concessional flows, and some kind of reinvigorated debate around public goods. I will try to develop that further later on. Sorry. This graph shows where we are in Brazil. These numbers in the bottom, they show the epidemiological week. We are in the 16th week. We are basically here in the beginning of the scale. Europe is probably around this region here, and the US is around here. We are beginning the curve. Everybody saw this curve, but nobody saw this, probably few people saw this curve applied to developing world. And we are starting now to escalate the curve. And what we need now urgently is humanitarian access to developing countries. The Doctors Without Borders cannot access Ecuador now. There are no flights to Ecuador to deliver humanitarian response. We must have access to vulnerable groups. The most terrifying scenario in Brazil is related to the incarcerated population. People will die in prisons in a number that we never saw before. And this is really, really, really unprecedented humanitarian crisis. And we have to protect the humanitarian health workers. We are fighting now to PPEs, around PPEs. We are fighting now about around equipment. We have to provide food security. We have to provide emergency basic income programs. We have to create emergency basic income programs. These programs are being created in countries like Brazil and Argentina now. We must have programs to support businesses, but these programs have to be conditional. And we have to cancel debt of LDCs and suspend, sorry, this is a mistake, it's a typo, suspend the debts of lower middle income countries. Countries like Argentina, and in a while Brazil will not have space to issue more debt. And we have to take advantage of this momentum to set up a rights-based global public goods agenda. This is a very bold and delusional, if you want, agenda, but I think it's the case that we should start to talk about rights again. First, the right to health. There is already a convention which was presented 3 or 4 years ago by an alliance which is hosted in the University of Georgetown in the US around the global health regime. It's a global health convention which is binding, and it is based on the idea of universal systems, and not only around the idea of a universal access.
We are a little bit over 8 minutes.
Thank you. Or around epidemiological surveillance. We must have an agenda for basic income. We have now a very good momentum since almost all the countries are actually adopting emergency basic income programs. We have a momentum now to discuss a permanent basic income program at the global level. And again, what we are facing now is probably something that is far beyond what we are going to face in terms of climate change. So in a way, what we are seeing now is a global crisis that announces something that is to come, that is about to come, which is the climate crisis. To set up this rights-based agenda around global public goods, I think we should bring back the global, reinvigorating multilateral institutions, increasing concessional flows, and increase core contributions to multilateral institutions, and not only earmarked contributions. Bringing the public back in, which means we have to discuss again taxes, we have to create global funds to provide and to make these rights happen. And finally, we have to bring the language of the vocabulary of rights back in, and not only the vocabulary of vulnerability. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much, Stefan.
Thank you so much, Paulo. My goodness, we have so great presentations. I like all your slides, not at least 3 scenarios, this new normal with competition within countries. I think that's great, the old normal. And I mean, global public goods, I think last week when we had the discussion, it popped up already several times. I think this is really something what we also should follow up. So great, really great. Thank you so much. Before I turn to our last speaker, let me just say, if you want to raise your hand, just do it during our last presentation, because just after the last presentation, we will pick up a few questions and comments. So last but not least, we have Annalisa present. She's working with the Overseas Development Institute, ODI, London, UK. Annalisa, great to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you for organizing such great kind of series of seminars. And it feels like being among friends as well. There might be many kind of different aspects we might want to talk about the implications of COVID-19 for international cooperation. I try to focus my reflections of 3 different points. The first one is around the future for bilateral aid budgets. We already talked about that, and we can see that also in the chat, but also about aid modalities. The second point is what Stefan kind of mentioned at the very beginning, how this kind of current crisis can accelerate the transition from a traditional recipient donor aid paradigm to one of international cooperation among countries. And finally, I would like to reflect upon some of the implications of the current crisis for the future of multilateral development banks and for vertical funds. So going back to the future for bilateral cooperation, I mean, in the chat, Iain mentioned earlier on, yes, aid budgets at the time of the global financial crisis weren't really much affected. But if I were to recall the conversations that we were having in September, October 2008, actually, most of us were really concerned about plummeting aid flows. This crisis is multiple on different fronts, but I'm trying to kind of see potentially kind of a bright side, and I'll go back to it in a second. I do recall again at the time of the global financial crisis in 2008, the then president of the World Bank, Robert Zoellick, proposed a vulnerability fund. I'm not calling for a fund at this stage, but certainly kind of thinking about of the all fiscal stimuli packages that members of the Development Assistance Committee are putting together. Should we kind of allocate 0.7%, not of GNI, but of the fiscal stimuli? I think we all know the reasons why aid budget should be scaled up, and probably it's a kind of relatively old argument. And probably some of you may have seen the joint statement by the members of the Development Assistance Committee on Thursday, calling for DAC members to strive actually to keep ODA budget. Others said there's scope to expand that. If we apply based on the kind of figures we had last week on the fiscal stimuli packages, we're talking about around 30% more of the current bilateral ODA budgets. It's a lot, but not impossible. We shouldn't also just focus on volumes, but we should also reflect on the modalities. The response should be quick and rapid. And I think also the kind of instruments we should use should reflect that. And I'm thinking around kind of the use of budget support. Perhaps bilateral donors should kind of channel their own resources via donors that are already providing general or sector budget supports like the European Union, or perhaps thinking about working more closely with local actors. I'm going now back to my second point. The current kind of crisis trying to accelerate the transition away from a traditional aid paradigm to one of international cooperation among countries. And I've seen that in 3 different kind of aspects. The first one, and it was covered also in the last seminar, the relationship between North and South recipient donor is somehow blurred. I'm Italian, as you can detect from my accent, and of course, I was moved by the initial interventions and support from the likes of China, Albania, Cuba, to my own country at the peak of the emergency. Italy is a G7 country, is a high-income economy, and this is somehow a good example of assistance also to countries that are normally donors themselves. The second point is around, and this is somehow what Andreas also mentioned at the very beginning, somehow a shift not necessarily about money, but also towards knowledge sharing, technical assistance. And this is something we've already seen in some of our earlier kind of projects at ODI I led, the implications of moving away from aid for upper middle income countries. The demand wasn't for money. It was primarily around expertise, knowledge sharing, capacity building, learning from others that already kind of experienced certain challenges. And this is again was one of the examples I concretely seen also in my kind of hometown back in Italy. And the third point, I mean, we have already said that. I mean, these are kind of global challenges requiring global solutions. But it shouldn't be just the kind of ministries of foreign affairs, the development ministries where it applies. This is a challenge that goes well beyond development cooperation. And I would strongly argue for other departments, the Department of Health when it comes to pandemics, environmental ministries when it comes to climate change, to contribute with their own budget for international cooperation. And I'm going to my third kind of group of reflections around the kind of future for multilateral development banks and vertical funds in light of the crisis. Of course, we would expect development partners to do more, but the World Bank, the regional development banks have actually reacted quite quickly and at scale. I believe they have quite a privileged position when it comes to handling this sort of crisis because of a unique combination of financing at scale, technical expertise, knowledge, convening power. There are, as you probably might know, there are a few kind of replenishment rounds happening this year. Beyond the multilateral development banks, I'm talking about Gavi, there's also IFAD, and there is time to be more generous and not only kind of keep the pledges at a kind of baseline, but also to increase them. We also are aware that a couple of multilateral development banks, I'm talking about the World Bank, the African Development Bank, have just gone through more recently, one of them a couple of years, the other one through general capital increases. I believe down the line, this should happen as it happened in 2010 after the global financial crisis. And the very last point I want to make, for some of you who have been working on strategy and policies with multilateral development banks, you might be aware of the kind of debate around graduation of middle income countries from assistance from multilateral development banks. I don't want to recycle what I've done before, but I really believe that the kind of the purpose of a multilateral development bank is a cooperative one. So supporting countries independently from their income per capita. I mean, the argument of not kind of lending to upper middle income countries is because of the kind of subsidy related with that. So why should these organizations subsidize countries that might go to international capital markets themselves? But I do believe, again, it's not just about money, but it's around knowledge sharing, policy dialogue, and expertise. And I think this kind of current crisis showed us the need to rethink and reflect about graduation from multilateral development banks and vertical funds. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Annalisa. That was a very important additional dimension or several dimensions to our discussions. I think aid modalities as a topic, I think I would also think this is highly relevant since we are going to see this kind of external support approach, which is much more relevant for a number of countries. So aid modalities, aid coordination, aid effectiveness has a very important role to play. And also the question about the role of multilateral development banks, the debate about graduation is also something what is highly relevant. We have a few minutes left. We don't have any raised hand at the moment. I was just following a bit the incoming questions from our chat channel, and let me just indicate three questions I've picked up, and panelists can select maybe one to respond in a minute. The question about G20 as a potential important club governance mechanism to deal with the crisis. What does it mean for those countries not represented in this club, so especially low-income countries. We had a couple of contributions about the fiscal dimension, the debt GDP ratio, which will rocket this year. So how can we deal with those fiscal financial challenges we are expecting? And I also picked up one question related to South-South cooperation as a more state-centered development model. Is it a good alternative to rather traditional development models followed by OECD donor countries? So those are three questions you might want to respond to, but also you can consider to respond to one of the fellow panelists. So I would just give to you the floor again in the order we organized our discussion. So Andrea, maybe 30 to 60 seconds. This is not a lot, but a bit.
Thank you, Stefan. I was very glad to hear all the other panelists, and just maybe to respond to this last one on South-South cooperation and those modalities. I think that what we've seen is that this concept of capacity development and joint expertise of South-South cooperation is going to be very, very useful. But I think that what we've also shown is that in this idea of having a win-win arrangements are difficult in a time when none of the countries are really in a full capacity to respond to their own challenges. Right, so I think that's the challenge for South-South cooperation. That for most of South-South, you know, there's very little that we've seen of that so far, because each country has so much already to deal with internally, unfortunately.
Great, thank you so much, Andrea. Iain?
Thanks, Stefan. I think I just want to amplify something someone said in the comments, which was around reframing global health security. And I've done a piece of just a bit of analysis on this, where if you look at Our World in Data, they look back at number of terrorist deaths that there have been over the last 2 decades, and there are about 21,000 a year, and a very small amount of those are in the West. Whereas the projections for COVID deaths are in the order of magnitude of millions globally. So I think 1.8 million was what Imperial College estimated. So if you look at the amount of effort and geopolitical effort, financial resources on security, and if that was the September 11th response, if you calibrate that to this crisis, then I think you should expect something much more, and we should make that global health security argument.
Thank you so much, Iain. Kigobo?
Yes, thank you. I want to respond to this South-South cooperation. I do think it's really very limited to just emphasize this South-South cooperation at this time from this crisis corresponding. I do think some cooperation between those South, North international organizations are quite critical and important, because it's related not only in this financial cooperation or financial support, but also some information sharing and some other learning. I do think because from this China's responded from the first time, we already saw that there are different ways, and also the following, the different countries corresponding. We already saw the different ways of corresponding, and also different contributions. The collaboration actually were already in different ways. So we cannot just rely on only like the previously. We do think South-South may have more close or more similarity, so it can actually have some parallel learning opportunities. Actually, from this time, I do think I realized we should actually combine together. We cannot just define all those separated segregation more.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kigubo. Paulo, what is your final statement?
I will address the question of South-South cooperation, but before that, regarding the WHO issue, the WHO, if you take the chronology, the WHO worked quite well during this crisis, worked quite well since the provocation from China, since the notification from China, worked quite well in sharing the experience that was put in place in China, worked quite well in declaring the emergency, and worked quite well in terms of the pandemics. But the WHO is being underfunded by almost 20 years and has no capacity to respond accordingly to this crisis. And we should now strengthen the WHO again, not only in terms of pandemic security or vigilance against pandemic, but especially in terms of a global health convention, which would allow us to have access to medicines and all the services and all the coverage in health. And this is how South-South cooperation comes to the fore. I think there's a dimension of South-South cooperation which is called structuring cooperation that works strengthening the health systems and the systems of food security in the countries. And this structuring dimension should be strengthened now.
Thank you so much, Paulo. Annalisa, your final word.
Very quickly, I'm not covering the kind of the points you raised, Stefan, but kind of a question that was in the kind of chat. What role for the EU? Certainly, as I kind of mentioned earlier on, budget support is a kind of quick way, and the European Union is still the dominant kind of partner in that. And again, coordination. We're talking about quite a few diverse kind of set of initiatives by bilateral donors, and a coordinating role will be kind of extremely important. I'm mindful of time. I'm just finishing with one point around the kind of future of aid flows and potential scenarios. Please watch this space in the next couple of months. We're starting working on this specifically in our team and ODI scenarios and kind of analysis based on the kind of previous crisis.
Great. That was clever, Annalisa, and we are really looking forward to this communication. Colleagues and also to the audience, I mean, that was a really rich discussion. I mean, we were asking you for something what is impossible in a way. I mean, we are maybe still in the beginning of a crisis situation. We all expect that the consequences will be really very significant. And to start already this kind of discussion, I think it's really important. At the same time, it's not easy to respond to it. And so you did a fantastic job. So thank you so much for this. Having said this, one aspect I wanted to highlight, this maybe as a question for our third webinar, and I think one of you mentioned it already, at least briefly. Let's say this kind of recovery situation, which we are hopefully having very soon. I think from my understanding of the situation, looking back at the year 2019 and the visibility of climate change challenges, we need to have this kind of better recovery or green recovery approach. And I think it would be probably also good that during our discussions, we are trying to have it as one fundamental dimension in our debate. So this is not to complain about something, but as you know, wrapping up is always difficult. So just highlighting something what we should also discuss for the next couple of opportunities where we have the opportunity to debate, to discuss, to engage. So thank you so much again. In 2 days from now, at the same time, we have our third webinar. We also plan to share with you maybe some first action points we might identify, or at least we would share with you a plan how we could, you know, develop something like an action point plan. So please join us again in 2 days for our third webinar. Thank you so much. Have a great day, have a great afternoon, have a great night, and hope to be connected with you all very soon. So thank you so much.
I will be ending the meeting now.